All right, so let's dive in. We've got some incredible sources today, all pointing to one really dramatic year, 1918.
It's a year that I think most people just associate with the end of World War One.
Exactly, the climax of the war. But what these sources show is something far more complex, a sort of, you know, terrifying collision.
A collision of three massive forces, really.
Right. You have the war, of course, but then at the very same time, you have the deadliest disease outbreak in modern history. And on top of that,
An unprecedented government campaign to, well, to control what Americans were allowed to think and say.
and that collision point is really our mission for this deep dive. We need to trace how the Wilson administration's obsessive focus on war will, on total psychological mobilization, actually left the country wide open and, frankly, fatally vulnerable to a biological disaster.
That's it. There's this core insight that just jumps out from the sources.
Which is?
That in 1918, the U.S. government built this national megaphone that was so loud, so powerful.
That it just drowned out the warnings.
It completely drowned out the vital warnings about the global plague that was heading straight for them.
So we have to start there, with the enemy they couldn't see, the invisible one.
Exactly. The invisible enemy. And even now, a century later, the scale of the 1918 influenza pandemic it's just astonishing.
Give us the numbers. What are we looking at globally?
Globally, the estimates vary, but we're talking about a catastrophic event that killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people.
100 million.
Yeah. I mean, to put that in context for you, that's more lives lost to the flu than in all of World War I combined.
Wow. And what about here in the U.S.?
The sources put it at approximately 675,000 Americans.
That is just a staggering number.
It really is. And it becomes even more chilling when you look at it through the lens of U.S. military history. The 1918 flu killed more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
All of them combined.
Combined, this wasn't a side story. This was a central tragedy unfolding right in the shadow of the war.
Which brings us to the name, the Spanish flu. It's one of the great ironies here, because the sources are pretty clear it likely started right here in the U.S.
That's right. There was some unusual flu activity noted early in Haskell County, Kansas. But the first really big confirmed military outbreak was at Camp Funston, Kansas on March 4th.
So why Spanish?
It was pure political spin, really. All the warring nations, the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, they were all censoring the news about the illness. They didn't want to hurt morale.
Right, can't look weak.
Exactly. But neutral Spain wasn't in the war. So their press reported on it freely. They even reported that their own king was sick.
So because they were the only ones telling the truth.
The world just assumed it was coming from there. And that censorship, that act of minimizing the threat, it undoubtedly cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
And the military itself, the very thing we were building to win the war, it became the perfect distribution system for the virus.
It was a devastating feedback loop. You had these cramped training camps, these packed transport ships.
Perfect incubators.
Perfect incubators. The virus spreads like wildfire through the camps, then it gets shipped overseas with the troops where it mutates, becomes even deadlier, and then that second wave comes back home in the fall of 1918.
And the symptoms of that second wave were just horrific. We read about the Purple Death.
That name came from the severe cyanosis. Victims would turn this dark blue, almost black color because their lungs were failing. They were starving of oxygen.
Drowning in their own fluids.
Literally. But the thing that really baffled doctors then was who it was killing.
It wasn't the very young or the very old, which is what you'd expect with the flu.
No, it was targeting healthy young adults, people between, say, 25 and 45, the strongest members of society.
And now we think we know why.
Yeah, modern science points to something called a cytokine storm. Basically, this flu strain was so new and aggressive that in a person with a really strong immune system, it triggered a massive overreaction.
Their own immune system turned on them.
In a way, yes. It flooded their lungs with so many microbe-fighting agents that it destroyed their own tissue. Their strength, tragically, became their biggest vulnerability.
And this is where that collision we talked about becomes a verifiable tragedy. The government's absolute priority was morale, and they had legal tools to enforce that priority, to enforce optimism.
You see the catastrophic result of that policy most clearly in Philadelphia. It's the textbook example of what happens when you put propaganda before public health.
So this is September 1918. The flu is raging.
It is. Doctors are practically begging the city to cancel large public gatherings. But there's a huge Liberty Loan parade scheduled to promote war bonds.
And canceling would hurt morale.
Exactly. It would look weak. So, against all medical advice, They held the parade on September 28th. Hundreds of thousands of people packed together.
And the flu's incubation period is just a couple of days.
2 to 3 days. And like clockwork, 2 days later, cases just exploded across the city. Within 6 weeks, 12,000 Philadelphians were dead.
12,000.
At its peak, 759 people died in a single day. The city's infrastructure just collapsed.
The sources describe a complete breakdown of society.
It was chaos. They ran out of coffins. They had to dig mass graves with steam shovels. There are accounts of priests literally driving carts through the streets, shouting for people to bring out their dead.
And the newspapers, they were part of the problem.
They absolutely were. Whether it was out of patriotism or fear of prosecution, they ran headlines downplaying everything. It's just the plain la grippe, the normal flu.
So public trust just vanished.
It evaporated. So when officials finally did try to issue real warnings, nobody believed them. People were terrified, isolated. The social fabric just came apart because the truth itself had been deemed too pessimistic to print.
And yet life had to go on. There's this jarring contrast in the sources.
It's so stark. You have the York Dispatch reporting that every saloon and place of amusement is being closed indefinitely to stop the spread.
Making Philadelphia bone dry.
Right. And in the very same breath, you have newspapers like The Forward in New York, urging newly enfranchised women to gather in crowded tenements to register for the midterm elections.
So you have this collision of democracy and disease. Do you risk your life to exercise your brand new right to vote?
That was the choice. And that pressure, that constant push for mobilization, it all came from one place. The Committee on Public Information, the CPI.
The national megaphone.
That's the one. President Wilson set it up in April 1917 because he saw public opinion as a literal weapon of war. It wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be aimed and fired.
And its head, George Creel, his mission was to fight for the minds of men, to sell the war.
And the scale of what they did was just groundbreaking.
Yeah.
They understood modern media in a way no one had before. The most famous part of their operation was probably the 4 Minute Men.
A brilliant idea, really. They took advantage of a captive audience.
75,000 volunteers.
Yeah.
And they would go into movie theaters and give these short, patriotic, pre-written speeches.
In the 4 minutes it took to change the film reels.
Exactly. You couldn't get away from it. They reached an estimated 130 million people with specific calls to action, buy bonds, conserve food, report your neighbors if they speak against the draft.
It turned a passive audience into active participants. And then there were the posters.
The division of pictorial publicity. Creel knew you had to hit people in the gut, emotionally. So he got the country's best artists to create these incredibly dramatic images.
Like that famous one, Beat Back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. It's pure fear.
And it worked. It raised billions.
Right.
But they also published the government's first daily newspaper, the Official Bulletin, which went to every news office in the country. It guaranteed a single, dominant, government-approved narrative.
So this voluntary censorship they talked about wasn't really voluntary at all. It was backed up by some very real legal threats.
Oh, absolutely. That's the other side of the vice. This is where the Sedition Act comes in.
Passed in May of 1918.
And it made it a federal crime to use any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the flag, or the military.
That language is so broad.
It was meant to be. Spreading pessimistic stories, which could mean anything from questioning the war to, say, accurately reporting on the severity of pandemic, was punishable by up to 20 years in prison.
And to enforce this, they didn't even need a huge police force. They had volunteers.
The American Protective League, the APL. It was a civilian organization, but it was sanctioned by the Department of Justice. 250,000 everyday Americans in 600 cities.
And their job wasn't just to find spies.
Critically, no. Their job was to listen, to report on their neighbors, their coworkers, anyone spreading that pessimistic talk. It created this pervasive culture of fear where you couldn't trust anyone.
And the Supreme Court actually backed this up after the war.
They did. In Schenck v. United States, the court established the clear and present danger standard. Justice Holmes wrote that free speech doesn't protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic.
But the terrible irony here is that public health officials wanted to shout fire because there was a fire.
Exactly. But under that law, telling the truth about the flu would cause panic, which was the very thing that was criminalized. It was a legal catch-22. They could either tell the truth and risk 20 years in jail, or they could stay silent and let people die.
The tragedy in Philadelphia was almost legally inevitable.
It was baked into the system they created.
So with all this happening on the home front, how did the war itself finally end?
Well, despite the flu sidelining millions of soldiers on all sides, the American Expeditionary Forces were decisive. You had these massive offensives in the fall of 1918, Battle of Saint-Mihiel, which was the first all-U.S. offensive,
And then the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
the biggest battle in American history. Over 1 million U.S. troops. It was just an overwhelming push that forced Germany to the table. The armistice was signed, and hostilities officially stopped at 11 a.m. on November 11th.
And what's amazing is that as soon as the war ended, George Creel shut down the CPI, just turned it off.
He did. He ordered all campaigns to cease immediately. He was adamant that an organization like that had no place in a peacetime democracy.
But the ideas, the techniques, they didn't just disappear.
No, they didn't. And this is where the story takes a very dark, unintended turn.
You're talking about who was studying these methods.
I am. The sources note that Joseph Goebbels, who would become Hitler's propaganda minister, reportedly studied the CPI's methods very closely. He admired how they could crystallize public opinion through total media saturation and emotional appeals.
So the techniques built to save a democracy were later used to build a totalitarian state.
It's a deeply troubling legacy. And the final cruel irony involves Wilson himself.
He got the flu.
It's widely believed he did, yes. He collapsed during the Paris Peace Conference in April 1919. Many historians argue the illness severely impaired his judgment, and that the flawed, punitive peace treaty that resulted was, in part, a consequence of his sickness.
So the enemy his administration refused to acknowledge may have undermined his single greatest diplomatic goal.
It's an incredible convergence. You have this paradox. A nation fighting for democracy abroad by suppressing speech at home, creating a climate of fear where a plague could run rampant because mandated optimism made the truth a crime.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought from the sources.
Right. After Creel saved the CPI's physical archives, Congress basically abandoned them. The records of this entire massive propaganda machine were literally dumped into trucks and almost lost forever, saved only by chance.
So what's the thought for our listeners to take away from that?
It's this. Given that these powerful, centralized propaganda methods were later studied and adopted by totalitarian regimes, what responsibility does a democracy have in the aftermath of a crisis to ensure that the tools of mobilization it created are not just shut down, but are truly and completely erased? Think about how the techniques can survive and be weaponized elsewhere, even when the agency itself is destroyed.